doing here?
We are going to talk about the difference between a bracket and a guild, which sounds kind of weird at first, but then we're going to talk about how XP off brackets, which except for the brackets that have cap players, they actually act more like guilds. There's a gap there that I think that would really help illuminate a lot of the history of XP off and a lot of the challenges that we face now in a way that we haven't framed before. So draw upon your twinkerage to be able to make this work, is what I'm saying. I just wanted to say twinkerage.
I somehow had that thought deep inside.
I don't think it was so deep inside.
No, probably not.
Let's get started. In essence, so we're talking about WoW. WoW is a public game. That's the whole point of an MMORPG. Anybody can come in, go out. They can do pretty much anything they want in the game within the set boundaries Blizzard makes. Some of those are coded in the game of things you can do and can't do as far as just basically player action. Some of that's basically standards by Blizzard, like you can't bot, you can't cheat, some people do it anyway, and so forth. But the whole point of WoW is it's a public game. It's something that anybody can get into. Guilds are private. You've got GMs and their fellow guildies. They're the ones that establish the standards of a guild, or maybe some rules, the expectations of how things are going to work, and so forth. That goes beyond what Blizzard sets. So like back in TBC, there was an all-druid 29 guild on my home server.
Really?
Isn't that weird? Like, if you wanted to be in the guild, you had to be a 29 twink, this is before XP off, and a druid. And this guild had 7 or 8 people in it.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah. I was like, alright, that's kind of weird, but it worked. There it was. And this is before.
You could get your tank, you could get your FC, you could get your, caster, you can get your range.
Healer, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
Yep, got your range. They had everything. Druids offered everything. It's like, we're going to do an all-druid guild. It was an intriguing idea. Yeah, this is before they had merged battle groups and merged, so this is literally just on one server. The biggest conflict for twinking is that a lot of players have this belief that if the game lets me do it, then I should be able to do it. Versus what's good for, say, the community of a given bracket. That's the fundamental conflict that a lot of players run into. And when we use the word community, it's like, community is kind of this weird word where we're talking about like basically for the good of all the players in a particular bracket, but we always know there's going to be inevitable spoilers. And that's the problem we run into. You've got players who, they want games. They want what's good for the bracket, but they know there's going to be the overpowered hunter in Wrath, or that there's going to be the boomkin that blows faces away in Mop in a given bracket. If you're a player, you're a twink. You're there to min-max. That's what you do. And if you can blow people up or keep people alive forever, or anything between, that's what the whole point of twinking is. And there's a fundamental conflict between trying to be the best you can be and exploiting every possible end to get there, versus understanding that sometimes that's not going to be what's healthiest or best for the bracket. There's going to be larger concerns for a whole community of twinkers. And the problem
do you have any examples just to kind of highlight that?
I do. See, and that's the thing. They're both right. Both sides are right, and that's why this is a tough conflict. So, like back in Wrath, 29s and 39s, they both banned aimed shot. They knew that aimed shot was going to misbalance things in the bracket from the way they wanted it. So they said, alright, no aimed shot hunters, the ban lasted for months. Likewise, 39s has established kind of a soft ban on not using the sulfur on Slammer to break fears. They were just kind of
Except for Hail Shot. He was goddamn chugging those things like candy.
Well, there you go. So you've always got this conflict between, look, this is what twinking is about. This is what makes me the best at what I do. Every little edge I can get, I'll use, versus, alright, how much of a slippery slope do we want here? So meanwhile, in Wrath, you've got 29s and 39s who are banning a specific ability. This is the first time they've ever banned anything, and they got a lot of success from that. Meanwhile, over in Kata, 19s are filled with hunters and rogues, right? And people are like, oh, that's all they do is play hunters and rogues. It's the only, everything is OP on that. And they're still getting games. Like, it's not like the bracket died instantly when everything went hunters and rogues. For months, it was all hunters, it was all rogues. That's how you played 19s.
But do you think
that the culture of the brackets, and not even just to that, but perchance the barriers presented to making a 19 versus 39 had anything to do with that?
Absolutely. I think those all had an influence there. And I certainly don't want to boil this down to, well, there's this conflict in twinking between the good of the community versus the good of the individual. There's a lot of factors involved there. But I do want to say that at the end of the day, when you put those all together, that's where the basis of all the decisions got made. Do we want to be the kind of bracket, and this is the verbiage they would use, do they want to be the kind of bracket where it's every person for themselves and you throw you to the wolves and learn how to do your crap and get her done? Or do you want to be the kind of bracket where you're going to try and wire in a little bit of growth, wire in a little bit of standards so that the bracket would work better? And I put better in quotes because what better was, people would argue about on both sides of that conflict.
Yeah, because you could ask 10 different people and you'll probably get 10 different answers to varying degrees.
Completely different answers. If you can have one bracket full of hunters and rogues and be able to get pug games, and another bracket that banned aim shot and be able to get pug games, the answer is not straightforward. They were both successes in their own right, in their own ways. And different players would choose to play in different brackets accordingly. That conflict, we see that all the time in a bunch of different brackets over the course of Twink history. Like we saw it was a big deal for 60s in Kata because when they were traditionally a more casual bracket, and they suffered through the worst Q bugs of anybody. It was a serious problem.
Was that the one where how the random, it goes through its cycle, and once it hits, say, AV, if you don't have the people to pop it, it just kind of stalls out on the tracks until it's popped, sort of thing?
Exactly. So that got fixed for every bracket pretty quickly except for 60s. So through all the 5.0.x patches, they would go through their first 3 random games, and then it would stall on AV because they couldn't fill it. And every day they could only play 3 games. It took them like a couple months just to figure that out. Now, the whole time frame from like 501, or maybe it was 503, all the way through to 5.1, we're talking it was a few months. It was a few months they stuck to it. And then they finally got things resolved. I want to say it was 5.1. I couldn't believe it. Blam, they finally get games again. They come to life. They're excited about it. Here they are. They're good to go in Kata. And this was about the time when people really started, went from being stuck in their own bracket to like, maybe I play a couple brackets to, hey, let's explore the brackets. And a host of players from other brackets, not aware of the 60s background and 60s culture and so forth, decided to roll a bunch of 64s. Because mathematically, playing 64 made a lot more sense than playing 60. That's what you do. So there was a culture clash that happened there, where it's like, I'm a twink, I do the best of what I do. I get the best gear. I get the best stuff. Why wouldn't you go 64? Stop being an idiot. Meanwhile, the 60s are saying there's this huge backlog of tradition of the way that we play. Why would you be an idiot? Go roll 60. That's how you play this. And a bunch of answers in between about whether or not you should use Wrath Gems or Wrath Enchants and so forth. There's a lot of disagreement about that. And eventually it sunk the bracket. That conflict literally took down that bracket. And the only reason it hasn't happened in the more flagrant example of 20s to 24s is because there's a bunch of expansion capped, which in this case is starter pack capped players, in that bracket. It's the same conflict. We see it over and over again. And the biggest thing, players get crazy about it. I don't blame them. But this is not a right versus wrong thing. That's the hard part of this. Both sides are right about what they're doing, but they're still in conflict with each other. And the biggest problem that we run into with that is that if you want what's best for your twink and you want to play at the top of your game and you want to do the best you can, but you also want to expand your bracket and you want more players to join and you want to be able to do more, you want more arenas, you want more games, you want more pugs, you want more premates, you might find those two desires you probably will find them in conflict with each other. That's a fundamental conflict. And we see it all the time when people say things like, you don't speak for the community. You don't, you say that this is what's best for the community, but I'm part of this community, and I disagree with you. Mm-hmm. Especially in the mid-brackets. We saw it happen all the time. This conflict, by the way, goes way beyond WoW. I mean, we could talk for days about the fundamental nature of of how this conflict works in a lot of different arenas, but as far as WoW specifically, notice that when we talk about the community for a given XP off bracket, it looks a lot like a guild. You've got people in a particular bracket who are leaders, fellow bracketeers. There are people who talk about standards for a bracket. An entire bracket may follow those standards. A great example of that is how mid-brackets, if games are misbalanced, like if it's a 10 versus 9, they'll sit somebody out. That's a standard for the mid-brackets. You won't see that in the lower brackets, and you won't see it in the upper brackets. It's not necessarily good or bad, but those are the kinds of things that the culture of a given bracket develops. Therefore, if you have a bracket, and you think about the community of that bracket like a guild, then you can start to boil this conflict down to a design issue. Players are going to twink. That's what we're here. We're here to be able to optimize our gear, to optimize our play, to optimize everything we possibly can, and we're really freaking creative. I mean, if somebody can figure out that you can go to Blade's Edge and pick up a Charged Crystal Focus with the help of a higher level player so that you can get an insta-heal from discharging these crystals, I mean, we're freaking amazing.
And then if you are a lock and you do that, it counts as a cookie.
Yeah.
And if you're spec, you get dub on that.
Seriously, you know? I mean, World of Warcraft players are really good at, even if you're not even an XP off, you're really good at twinking. That's the whole point of the game, is you optimize. And it just so happens that below endgame, there are some crazy ways to optimize. That is not the player's fault. Blizz knows that. That's why they work to balance things, more or less, to whatever degree that they do so. It's not the player's fault. That's the nature of the game, is to optimize. So then the key there is that if you want to sustain a bracket, if you want an XP off bracket to succeed, treat it like a guild, not a bracket.
So what exactly do you mean by that?
Of all the successes that we've seen in XP off over, I'm going to say the 6 some odd years that I've played this game, when we talk about the best of times for any particular bracket, there was always there was the staple parts of what you needed. You needed leadership. You needed players with a vision of, like, this is how we want things to play. This is how we want it to work. You needed a mutual respect between players where even if they don't necessarily agree on stuff, they did agree that they wanted to see games, or they did agree that they wanted games to at least work a certain way. Mm-hmm. And most of all, you needed this pair of, like, I'm going to call it accountability and autonomy. There's something about being in a guild. If you shoot your mouth off, or you're an ass to another player, or you are really just basically abrasive or causing problems, there's an accountability to that, where it's like it has an effect. You're accountable for what you do. Likewise, if you do some stuff that's really awesome, where you're helping other players out, you build a reputation, you make a difference, you're accountable for that. So it's not just a negative thing. It's being able to have the accountability, both good and bad, for what you do. But what goes with that is the autonomy. You need to have the freedom and the power to really explore that, to be able to find out how far you can take your twink, how far you can take your arena team, how far you can take a bracket. So at the core of getting any bracket to work, and all the best successes of 29s, 39s, 49s, even 59s and 69s back in the day, 19s at all expansions, all the expansion cap brackets at one point or another, there was always these core of group players, some in the foreground, some in the background, who really worked to either promote a bracket or to establish how a game went. The other players followed, that they promulgated the ways of the bracket, so to speak. And it differed sometimes it differed wildly, bracket to bracket, but that was there. And most of all, there was a mutual respect there. Even if you were a crappy player or a great player, it didn't matter which one, there were just certain things you adhered to in the way the bracket worked, because you wanted to be part of that bracket. You wanted to be part of what was going on. That's more like a guild than like a bracket.
So when you say, do you think kind of that, say we're like a guild, each guild has its own personality of sorts and its own culture. So say, let's use 39s as an example. The culture that 39s had established almost subconsciously rubbed off on people when they were coming in, where they're like, oh, I guess this is the way they do it, and they saw that it might be for the betterment of the bracket, and it was a way to get better games, so they, to use a terrible, terrible phrase, drank the Kool-Aid?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's exactly spot on, I think, because that can go either way. It can be constructive or destructive. 39s made themselves a very competitive environment. They had very low tolerance for you coming in half-geared and being an imbecile. That standard came in contrast to some other brackets that we've seen. And because of that, it attracted certain kinds of players, it repelled other kinds of players. But very soon, from entering that bracket, you got to feel that. You got to know, all right, this is the way this bracket runs. You show up in your pajamas, 39s will not tolerate that. This is back in, to some degree, in Wrath and more in Kata.
I would actually I would say it was going into the end of Wrath, and then it collapsed in Kata.
Eventually it did. I mean, it was pretty stringent in Kata in some places, but that collapses about right there. And then the flip side of that is 19's gained a reputation for graveyard farming, where that's what you do. That didn't come out of nowhere. That was something that had some star promotion in the bracket, and it eventually led to the types of games where people figured out who got farmed next. This is at the pug level now, I want to be clear. So because of that, when people come in, they assume that's the way it worked. And it helped propagate that type of activity in that bracket. You could say that for 19s, you can say it for 39s, they did stuff their way. Every bracket had certain idiosyncrasies about it. Sometimes it resembled the brackets near them, sometimes it didn't.
And that's also kind of like a guild, is it not? Where certain guilds might have those idiosyncrasies like, oh, I want that family style guild. Or I want the guild of a bunch of young college kids who are just having fun and messing around, and where each one of those brackets, if I'm understanding correctly, had something different to offer regardless of what you were looking for.
That's right. That's right. And while it was hard to find that information because it was just hard to find out about XP off after the split happened to even figure out what was going on there, every bracket did offer something. It had its positives, and it also had its, I'm going to say, requirements. I mean, it was just the way the bracket played, and getting familiar with that and comfortable with that could take some time and some adjustment depending on the type of player that you were and how much you wanted to be in that bracket and everything that it would take to be able to be part of that bracket. The second level, I think, that comes with the growth of a bracket is being able to delegate that kind of culture and promotion of standards across the bracket. When I talk about a bracket being like a guild, it sounds kind of weird in the face of some place like 39s where you had 3 or 4 seriously competing guilds with each other. They had different attitudes. Well, it's like you've already got sub-guilds. You've already got guilds playing in a particular bracket, and especially like in a place like 70s where you had major guilds all over the place and minor guilds on top of that. I mean, there's already very, big swaths of players or small clusters of players doing things together. But my point is that even with that, you still had a general feel for how the bracket worked.
Now, this part of it seems like it would be rather complex because using the guild analogy, guilds have defined roles with, say, someone joins in and they're a member. All they need to do is be active, and they might be bumped up to veteran. And then they show some promise, they get along with the officers, and look, next thing you know, they're an officer. So there's a clear line of succession and delineation of responsibility. Whereas what about if you're a bracket? Are there people out here like, all right, you're going to be in charge of getting new people, and you're going to be in charge of making sure people play fair? It doesn't really work like that, though, does it? Is it more of just some people kind of find their role and step into it?
I would argue that people just kind of find their role and step into it even in guilds. I mean, if you're lucky, you get some sort of structured leadership that way. I say if you're lucky, I'm not even sure if it's necessary. But absolutely it happens in a bracket. And I think that everybody, from any given bracket, you could point to a few players, at least, if not several, that influence the taste and the culture of a particular bracket, or even a particular endeavor in a bracket. Well, taking 20s, for example, if you play 20 arenas, and you're on, most likely, Korgath when you do that, although you might be on Vaj, you might be on Airy Peak, you might be in a few other places. But chances are, if you got into 20 arenas, you worked with Kochi. I mean, that That man did an immense amount of work and continues to do so to make 20 arenas happen. Without Kochi, I don't think it's unreasonable to say, I'm not sure 20 arenas would happen. That's a grand thing to say, but let's put it where it is. Calling out to Kochi, thank you for all your awesome time and effort in that. Holy Toledo. That's a major undertaking. It's kind of dramatic that way because the 20 arena scene is small enough that one person can make that much of a difference. But on a larger scale, I think we could look at any particular bracket and say this person made a big difference. Morton got the 29 started and off the ground after XP off.
We can even look at you for 29s. You definitely led the charge on one, if I'm not mistaken, 2 occasions. And either had the initial push or did a lot just with getting that list up in the front and the forum thread started to make sure people were aware. And you're like, hey guys, dust them bitches off. It's time to play.
Yeah. And there's the key. It can shift person to person at any given time. When R9 got 39s rolling again in the middle of Kata, and he just was like, all right, we're going to do this. And he did the thread. He did the organization of it. And he did it. He launched them. And they were able to get games for a couple of months after that.
Yeah, I was super proud of that little shit when he did it.
Yeah, that was a beautiful piece of work. That was great. Any one person can step up and do organizational work, but that's not the only thing they can do. They can step up to help a bracket in all kinds of ways, whether it's just being behind the scenes and helping people do the minor stuff like gearing up and getting their gear and getting armories to people and doing the informational stuff like that, or doing the things like helping people to learn the game. WoW used to be so much more of a player-focused game where players taught each other how to play this game. It's less like that as WoW has gotten more casual, but the hard part of that is that we don't have players as invested in this game as they used to be. And when a player does invest
right there, I want to touch on that for a second. By invested, what exactly do you mean by that?
There comes a point when you play World of Warcraft where you decide, and not all players do this, and that's fine, but you decide that if you want to do more with the game, you can't do it by yourself. And you can't just expect other players to show up and help you to be part of it. Whether you want to be a 5-man team blowing up dungeons, or whether you want to go raid, whether you want to PvP, RBG, at some point you decide, all right, look, not only can I not do this by myself, but I'll actually make more progress if I help other players join with me to do the kinds of stuff I want to do. At that point, you make more of an investment in this game as a player. You're putting in time to streamline the information that you need, to help players figure out the skills they need to have, to trade ideas about macros and about rotations, to get to know the area of the game that you're interested in. That's investment in this game. With that said, if you try and build a community inside a bracket, I feel at this point, after seeing so many attempts at that, I feel like it's doomed to fail. And that's pretty heavy words there. Trying to build a community in bracket saying that's going to fail. And I say that because as soon as the bracket changes, it's going to wreck the community. Also strong words. You have a bracket.
So do you feel there's an inflection point between growth and sustainability where it becomes almost like a make or break situation and generally tends to fall on the break side?
I don't. Actually, I don't think that's it. I think that when a community gets used to a bracket working a certain way and all of a sudden it changes on them, that unless the changes stay balanced enough that the bracket can basically figure a way to continue on without too much organization, they're doomed to fail. And the Kata burst was a great example of that. The burst was so strong in Kata that trying to deal with that was more than a lot of brackets could handle. And it became a serious issue in the 70 bracket. Do you remember in 70s, before they nerfed Big Daddies, when someone figured out that Big Daddies could literally one-shot an entire group of people? And you lob this bomb in the middle of Alterac Valley, could rack up 7 kills if you timed things right, you know?
I had thought that was the 60s, but it probably, even if it wasn't, I'm sure. Or was that the bolt gun?
Both. The bolt gun did the same thing, but that was single target. No, it wasn't single target, it was just a smaller radius. Yep. And there were 60s with grandfathered engineering that had access to Big Daddies. You know, it's like the Big Daddies were slaying brackets. It was funny at first, then it was annoying. Then games started to peter off because, like, why? If I'm going to be in 70s in engineering, I mean, it's nice to have a Tazix shocker and all that. But if you had a Big Daddy, it was expensive. It didn't matter. It was insta-win. And the bracket started to decline. The next patch came out. That was the first time that Blizzard put in scaling for engineering items. It was still strong, but nowhere near strong. I mean, it was fixed to the point where people stopped throwing them. It just wasn't worth it. So they still use the bolt gun for interrupts at some point, and everyone still loved the Tazix shocker, but it wasn't anywhere near as bracket breaking. That's a great example of when you try and build a community in a bracket and the bracket takes a hard right or a hard left, your community's in big trouble, you know?
So it almost seems you could have the best foundation laid and have the world's greatest construction crew working for you. But if Blizz comes in with some unforeseen Katrina, there's not a whole lot that you can do to keep that foundation up.
As long as your attitude is it has to be based on the bracket, yes. So here comes the confusing part, and I think here's the converse where it succeeds. If you try and build a bracket around a community, that's where I think you can succeed. And we've seen this happen, especially in the mid-brackets, where things are just messed up. And MOP is a great example of that. I'm sorry, your prot warriors and your shadow priests and your prompt paladins, I mean, they're just wreaking so much havoc that a lot of brackets have just been dormant for longer than we've seen in years. Mm-hmm. I mean, to be at a point where the only real live brackets right now we have are 20 to 24 and 85, and the only reason they're live is because we have expansion capped players in those brackets who are feeding those games. That's it. That is it. That says a lot about how crazy things are messed up in the brackets. Meanwhile, in the background, in a couple of other brackets, we have players who are acknowledging that things are as messed up as they are, and they're making some pretty ridiculous rules to be able to get games forward, but they're not obsessed about, well, we have to have these rules, and we have to ban this, and we do that. They started off with, alright, if I'm going to play arenas at 20, if I want to do this, what is going to make worthwhile games for everyone? And they're making some choices that if you told somebody off the street, hey, you can only play in your skivvies and use white weapons and jump on one leg, they'd be like, why? That's not even twinking. Why the hell would I even do that? And the answer is, it's not about twinking in the sense of maximizing your player. It's about, this is a group of players that want to get together and play games that are fun and balanced. And they're taking it upon themselves.
At that point, more instead of maximizing the individual player, maximizing the players as in plural experience.
As in plural. Exactly. That's where we get back to this idea of community, about a bracket. We call it a bracket. We call it the 20 XP off arena players, or the 20 XP off BGs, which are a totally different thing. 39s, 49s, 59s. We like to refer to all of these brackets as something that Blizz denominated the boundaries on. But in reality, it's dictated by a group of players, small or large, who've decided to adhere to the kinds of standards in a way that a guild would adhere to them. This is the way the guild works. This is what's acceptable in the guild. This is what's not acceptable. A bracket is doing the exact same thing. And I didn't make that connection until MOP came along and made things so crazy that the only way a bracket could succeed was to do that kind of thing, was to fully recognize that. And that's why 29s and 39s are seeing some successful arenas here and there, or even some war games. And they're doing things by invite. In fact, here's a great example of that. So earlier in MOP, 19 pugs were legendarily awful. I mean, they just were really, really bad. However, the pre-mades were really good. So they really took it upon themselves to make a whole lot of rules about you can't have more than 2 per class, and things you could do, things you couldn't do. Most pre-mades are like that, by the way. If you're going to do a pre-made, both sides agree on what's fair for both teams, and they put things together. And yes, there's optimization of who's got what gear and so forth, but we're talking like, small percentages optimization. What they're really going for is what's going to make games balanced. And the really interesting part that I'm surprised people don't talk about more were the 19 pug maids that went on for a while. So you had pugs that were of questionable quality at best. You had pre-mades that were really pretty good. Then you had this whole thing where a lot of 19s realized, hey, we need to get better games. We need to be able to get more people involved in this. We need to stop this whole two-tier approach and get more people involved. But a lot of people said, hey, look, I'm not ready for pre-mades. I don't even know how to go about doing it. I don't even know what that is as far as like how that works, because playing in a pre-made is so much different than basically pugging. So there was no middle ground. When 19s came through and started doing lots of stuff over Battletag and Real ID and organizing pugmades, where it was more casual than a pre-made, people didn't take the games as seriously, but it was a lot more organized than the craziness that they saw in pugs. Because they started to apply some of those standards of, let's pretend we're doing a pre-made that has standards, but we're not as super high-end as a pre-made may be. And they had a lot of success with that.
Yeah, it's like they could be a transient between, say, their actual guild, their bracket guild, and their real ID guild. They go through and decide what they want to do or how they want to do it almost.
Right. So you could have your fun and blow up face in the pugs if you wanted to. If you want to get into pre-mades, that option was there, but sometimes it wasn't immediately, not sometimes, often it wasn't immediately accessible, because doing a pre-made means you had to be good enough for it, or you had to be connected in a guild and all this. To create that middle tier of, let's get you used to the idea of what it's like, it was a cultural change that 19s engineered in the beginning patches of MoP that really I think is phenomenal. It was a really great piece of work. And that's something I hope HP talks about in his podcast at some point, because I think
we've talked about it extensively.
Yeah,
all of what you're saying is it was great and it was fun and a good thing for the bracket. That's definitely what I got out of our conversation.
Glad to hear that. And I say that as someone who didn't play 19s that often, but from the outside in, not only did it seem fun looking at it, but it also got a lot of good press. A lot of players were really happy with the kind of changes going on there.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about a difference between calling a bracket as something that Blizzard defines boundaries on and saying, do what you do, which is twinking, and max out your character and your abilities and your playstyle as best you can and then contribute to a bracket. If that puts you in a conflicting place of maybe that contributes to a bracket, maybe that hurts a bracket. And that sucks to be in that spot. But if you reverse it and say, all right, let's build the community first. Let's have players build an interest in playing with each other. Let's get some standards set about how they can go about doing that that's fair to everyone. Then the mutual respect and investment, and the respect that stems from having the mutual investment in making a community succeed, can build a bracket around that, even when the bracket gets as ridiculously crazy as MoP can make it with Blizzard's out of control misbalancing.
And that can't be stated enough. It's really pretty insane.
It is pretty insane. And the only thing more insane than that, from what I've seen, is the fact that there are pockets of players who are actually finding ways to make that work. That's insane. To be able to look at that and say, all right, everyone's working together, recognizing some strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes those strengths and weaknesses come from the game itself. Sometimes it comes from variations in how well the players play as far as skill, or as far as communication, or as far as latency in some cases. I mean, that kind of variation, the whole point of it is like, we can try and make hard and fast rules about warriors can do this or not do this, or you're allowed to use this piece of gear in the bracket or not. But a bracket community, a group of players that can look at an arena and say, all right, we're getting these 6 players together, we're going to play. We happen to know that this player is ridiculously well geared. That player, he's pretty new to the whole game itself, and this third player will be lucky if he doesn't DC every 2 minutes. And I'm exaggerating, but when you look at that and say, okay, let's be fair about this, let's build some good games out of these puzzle pieces, everybody wins. And to my utter shock and amazement, I'm watching some very unlikely places where players are winning. Brackets are actually growing behind the scenes. People are having fun, unbelievably, because they're starting with the community and making the bracket grow around that.
So let me ask you this, Rise. Do you think, in a weird way, this is almost like, let's say, the ultimate form of twinking?
I do. I do think it's the ultimate form of the twinking. I think it's the ultimate form of being able to say, yes, I want to optimize my character the best that I can. I want what's best for my character. I want to do the best. I want to play the best. I want to have the best edge I can get. But to shift that from saying it's an edge over everyone else to it's an edge with everyone else. For some players, it's immediately going to make them go, what? It's going to immediately make them wince. The whole point of twinking to them was to beat everybody. If you can shift that to a space where you can be your best by having other players push you farther than you could have gone on your own, if you can recognize that having worthwhile opponents will push you farther than just beating up random scrubs, and then if you can recognize that the more you invest in making an environment, making a community, making a bracket as conducive for that opportunity as possible, that is ultimate twinking.
I'm thinking that's an endpoint.
I'm thinking that's a beginning.
Well, you got to go all goddamn grand scope on me. I meant podcast-wise, but yes, you are correct, Ryan.
I couldn't resist. I was just like, and that is merely the beginning. But yes, that is a great...
You take your ball, you sit in your corner, and don't speak for 5 minutes.
I'm done here. I'm excited. I really didn't think we would see this kind of thing grow out of the ridiculousness that MoP brought us. There were so many missed opportunities in MoP. So many ways that the brackets really could have come together, and it didn't happen. To my utter surprise, I'm watching players start to come together in ways I just didn't think could happen.
And you know, it's interesting how you bring up the corollary between, say, a guild and a bracket. And most twinks, or XP off players, let me say, will identify themselves with one bracket or another. Like, for me, even though the bracket hasn't been alive for a while, it's like, well, what's your bracket? I would say 39s. And then I'd say, well, actually, no, I'd probably say 39s or 29s. But 39s is what I would consider home. So it doesn't seem like too far of a reach to say, yeah, that's my home, that's my guild, that's my bracket. Let's make it work within whatever confines Blizzard has set for us and whatever we have to do to get our bracket, or, to borrow your phrasing, which I actually kind of like more, our guild back together again.
I would bet that if everybody thought about their time twinking, if they thought about where they had the most fun, you'll see a few players who can pick out really awesome times for multiple brackets. That does happen. But I think you're right. Deep down inside, every player thinks about their home bracket. That bracket where maybe they got their start there, or maybe they didn't start there, but there was something about that bracket that just really called to them.
It's where you found your footing.
Yeah, it's where you found your footing. And even if you go to other brackets...
You got a place at the dinner table there. And
yeah.
You liked with serving.
There's a place at the table for you there. And even if you go to explore other brackets and have a lot of fun, even years on end, and play multiple ones at the same time, if there's a bracket that calls you home every now and then, that's like a guild. It's like a good guild. Yeah. That's how a bracket works. And I don't think that's an accident. I think that players care a lot about their favorite brackets in the same way that having that favorite guild makes an impact in this game.
I could not agree more, Raz. I could not agree more.
Good game.
Check out that scoreboard. You see all those dispels?
Mine had a bunch of interrupts.
And
we're done.
Now we're actually done.
Yeah.